So the first step to make this ombre soup is to mix my oils, and I'm checking the temperature on them because I don't want them to be too hot. I want to stay below 90 if possible. And I did melted the tallow and the coconut oil on a different container, and then I added the liquid oils that were already at room temperature, and these were the safflower and the olive oil, because I find that it helps temper the whole mix so that it's not too hot. Sometimes when I get the coconut oil and the tallow out of the microwave, it's a little too warm. Maybe it's in the 125 or so. So adding the room temperature oils helps bring the temperature down. And I also took the temperature of the light water. It was in the 80s because I had mixed it before. And then I'm going to add it slowly. I've noticed that ever since I started using the beads, and not the micro beads, but just the beads from Nature's Garden, I haven't had any flaky or big residue of lye on top of the lye water. So that is what I'm not using the strainer to add the lye water this time. And I remember last minute that I did want to add sodium lactate. And I usually add the sodium lactate to the lye water, but since I forgot and I had already poured half of it already, I decided to add it to the mix of the oils. So now I resume adding the remaining light water, and another reason why I want to soak at lower temperatures today is because I'm not sure what consistency I want for this ombre soap. I've never done it before, but I've seen it done when it's very liquidy, and I've also seen it done when each layer is a little bit of more like the consistency of mayo. And I think I want somewhere in between. I don't want it to be too liquidy, but I don't want it to be too thick either. So I check on my temperature, and now it's time to mix with the hand blender. So after mixing for a couple minutes, I did reach emulsification. It is not at the light trace phase yet, it's just emulsified. And I'm adding the fragrance. I am using Sensuous Sandalwood by Brambleberry. And I'm using the whole bottle because the bottle is like 1.75 ounces. And for this recipe size, I needed actually like 2 ounces of fragrance. In the fragrance as it is a little on the subtle side, but it's very nice. I like it. It's very like a perfume sort of smell. So I wish I would have had the extra because sometimes when fragrances are subtle, that means that during the cure process they may fade, but not all of them do. So I'm still checking now to see that it is truly emulsified and that I'm not having any rising. This fragrance is supposed to behave well, and I can say that it did. So now it's come the time to split the batch. I want to separate the part that I am going to color like a green color. I'm trying to simulate the color of sand. And I'm also adding cornmeal for texture and also to help with this color. Because what I want to do is I want to do a section that will be like the sand and another section that will be the ocean water. And I'm noticing some clumps from the cornmeal. So I'm going to use a whisk to try to break them up. I do not want to use the hand blender because it's a very small amount of soap dough mix, and usually when it's that low, the hand blender just incorporates air bubbles into the mix, and you don't want air bubbles when you're making soap. So now I just go back to the big portion of the soap, and I'm going to start with a very small amount of blue mica, and I'm using the teaspoon measuring, but I didn't fill it all the way. I only put maybe like half of the teaspoon, and then I'm using the hand blender to disperse the color throughout the mix. This is the first layer, and I'm gonna go from light to dark. So it is just barely there. Like you could barely see that it's blue, and that's fine because I'm going to be adding more and more. And I also added a teaspoon of titanium dioxide, so that because I was afraid that it was gonna be too yellowy, and then when you add blue, that it will have a green tint. I did not want that to happen. So what you see now is just a very light, very light blue color. So now it is time to start pouring the mix in the mold, and I did use a cardboard divider. So because my mix is still very liquid, and I knew it was going to be, that way they wouldn't just mix inside the mold. And I'm holding the divider in piece while I add the yellow color batter, so that the weight of both of them inside the mold against the cardboard will keep it even and will keep it from shifting. At this point, I realized I didn't have enough of the sand color mix, so I added more batter, and I added also a little bit more of titanium dioxide. And this is probably what explains why my sand looks white in the final soap, because I'm trying to compensate for the blue that's already on the extra batter that I added. And so somebody told me that where they're from in Florida, and it's true, the sand is white. So this is gonna be, I guess, a Florida beach theme soap. So now I'm going to add a tiny bit more of blue to the what's supposed to be the water mix, and I'm also using the blender. And this is one of the reasons why I wanted it to keep it very liquid too, because I knew I was gonna be using the hand blender to disperse. So if this was already at light trace when I began, then by the time I was adding more and more color, it was gonna be at medium or maybe very thick trace, which would have made it harder to evenly disperse the color. And I am using a spatula to help break down the fold. That way, the lighter layer at the bottom does not get broken into by this slightly darker one. Because I'm not after swirls right now, I'm after just different layers of color. So from this point forward is just the same thing, just adding a little bit of color of the blue at a time. And originally I had thought about doing the ombre effect because I figured that I will use less containers, so there will be less hand washing to do after I'm done soaping. However, it does take longer when you're just pouring one layer at a time and moving, adjusting the color, making it darker every time. But it was a fun and experiment, and I did like the end result for the most part, except for the sand color. Um, but that's what you will be seeing. So I'm going to speed it up a bit from this point forward. Now, there's something I want to point out is that after the second or third layers, I decided to use copper mica along with the blue mica to help darken the blue. And the reason why I chose this is because I did not want the butter to be too saturated with pigment to the point that it will change the color of the lather or the bubbles. And depending on what color you're doing, that's the complementary color that you need to use. Now for blue, the complementary color is orange. Now I do not have orange, but copper seems to turn into an orangey color once the soap is cured, which is why I thought of using it. Later on, I will be using charcoal powder to darken the blue. In But I did not want to use it yet because adding black to a color tends to make it dark really fast. And since I wanted that ombre effect, I wanted it to go slow, which is why I used the copper instead. And different colors, if you look at a color wheel, you will see what the complementary color is. And that is the color you will want to add when you want to get a darker shade of it. Now, somewhere when I was like halfway through, I started using a little bit of the charcoal powder to darken the color. However, the charcoal powder is off camera, so you don't see it. And what I'm doing right now with that piece of metal that you saw is that originally I wanted to create a wave effect. So whenever I had poured maybe 2 layers, like every 2 layers or so, I will use this metal piece, which is actually like a C clamp that I used, and it came with my pasta machine that I use for polymer clay. But it's just a very thick piece of metal, and my intention initially was to create like waves on the soup, but because the batter was too liquidy, that didn't happen. However, it did help on blending ever so slightly the layers, so that when you look at the final soup, there is not a very marked definition on each layer, but instead it seems to be blending really nice, and that's what I used it, and I think it helped. But maybe it didn't. I don't know. But I did try to use when I did the presents with that metal piece to just cover to go as deep as the last 2 layers of soap. And now I'm adding my very, I believe, last layer, which will be the darkest. And after this, what will be next is to add the seahorses. And I have actually, I think I should have waited for this to firm up a little bit more, because I do feel that the seahorses sank a little bit too much into the butter. But that's, something I learned for next time. Then when I was done pouring, I just took the divider and I slid it right up in a very fast, quick motion. And I also used all the soap that was in it. I put it back into the butter, not to waste. And I did try to make a design, but it was actually not needed because the seahorses were going to be covering it anyway. Now it is the next day and it's unmolding time. In reality, the soap was a bit too soft, but I was a bit too impatient. So I did unmold it and then I let it sit for a couple hours so that it will be a little bit easier to cut. And this is when I first discovered that the sand was more white than brown than I wanted it. But you could see some of the effect of the ombre effect. And now I'm cutting it. It was a bit tricky because it seems that it was still a little too soft, and I was using the crinkle cutter, so it was getting stuck to it, and because it was too soft, it was tricky to remove. But I went slow. I should have waited. Patience is truly a virtue when you are making soup. So anyway, thank you for watching, and I hope you like this video. If you would like to subscribe, feel free to do so. And if you want to get notifications, click on the notifications bell to receive them.